Welcome to the Disability Comes to Church podcast. My name is Stephen Bedard, and I will share in a moment about why I am starting this podcast. But first, do we really need another podcast, either on the church or on disabilities? Well, when it comes to the intersection of disabilities and church, I definitely think there is a need. I don't know of anyone who claims that the church is where it needs to be when it comes to welcoming and including people with disabilities. There are some congregations that do it better than others, but in general, the church has a long way to go. So, if there is a need to have such a podcast, what qualifications do I have to create such a thing? That's a great question. Probably, if you're familiar with the disability conversation at all, the first question will be whether I myself am disabled. While I generally don't use the label disabled, I will let you decide if it applies to me. So let me give you a short tour of how I became interested in disabilities. I had a few, but not many interactions with disabled people growing up. It was an era when disabilities were kept hidden from the mainstream society. But that would soon change, both for society and for myself. I married Amanda almost 25 years ago, and we knew for sure that we wanted children, and we started our family right away. Less than a year and a half after we got married, Logan was born. He was an amazing baby who was not only extremely cute, no bias of course, but was exceptionally bright. I intend to give a fuller description of what happened in a future episode, but for now, it's enough to say that he lost all of his vocabulary and that at a young age, he was diagnosed with autism. By this time, we already had another child, a daughter named Abby. She went into a sibling research study, and not long after, she too was diagnosed with autism. This shook our world. There's some controversy in the autism community over whether an autism diagnosis is something to be grieved or not. And I do want to explore that eventually, but I can say that the way the autism affected Logan and Abby was very difficult for us as parents. In the midst of this, I had started my first position as a solo pastor after a few years as a youth pastor and then an associate pastor. Here I was navigating not just what it was like being the father of two children with autism, but also what it looked like to include them in the church where I was pastoring. Interestingly, despite being a very small church, we had other children with disabilities there as well. My education on disability ministry came not from a seminary, but by being thrown into the situation and trying to make things work. Much happened after that, but I'm going to fast forward about 10 years. I began experiencing some health issues. It began with a sore ankle, but spread to a wide variety of symptoms which we struggled to understand, which, if any, were connected. I was eventually diagnosed with a fairly rare disease called sarcoidosis. While I have done fairly well since I was diagnosed, it continues to affect me and can be quite limiting physically. I might be able to go for a run one day and be walking with a cane the next, and then being back to normal, at least for me, that is, a few days later. But that wasn't the last diagnosis that I would get. Because of our children, autism became a central part of our lives. We lived and breathed autism. And it was in that mode that we noticed, and by we, I mean my wife first and then slowly me, that I had a lot of things in common with our autistic children. Not only that, there were certain things about my experience that just didn't seem typical of my peers. I always felt a bit different. I spoke to my family doctor about this, and he referred me to a psychological associate. After a number of tests and interviews, I was diagnosed with autism. It's the form of autism that would have once been described as Asperger's syndrome. but that's no longer an official diagnosis. Suddenly, so many things began to make sense for me. Not that the diagnosis has only been positive. In the midst of this, I was in the Doctor of Ministry program at Acadia Divinity College. I was struggling in my thesis, and with everything that was going on, I ended up changing my topic to disability ministry in small churches. It was a topic that I was passionate about, and I was able to complete my thesis, feeling that I had done something useful for the church. Much has happened since then. 2 other people in my family were diagnosed with ADHD, and another child was also diagnosed with autism. I've pastored at churches that have had high attendance by disabled people and have had discussions about disabilities in other contexts. Despite all this, I do not consider myself an expert in disabilities. I have very little background in the academic field of disability studies. I have done some work in disability ministry and disability theology. While I do have sarcoidosis and autism, I've had a fairly privileged experience and have not been near as marginalized as many others in the disability community. However, I do think I bring something to the conversation. I come at this conversation with 4 perspectives. I'm a parent of children with disabilities. I'm a person with an experience of disabilities. I am a pastor with 25 years of experience. And I've had some academic experience in disability scholarship, including teaching and research. None of that is to say I have all the answers. I know just enough to know how much I don't know. My intention for this podcast is to share some of my thoughts, but also to have conversations with other people who have different knowledge and experience than I have. I want to talk about both physical and intellectual disabilities. I want to have conversations about mental health. I also want to make the connection to the church, both in how we do practical ministry, but also how we think about these things theologically. I hope that you will stick with me on this journey. You can support this work in a number of ways. One is to subscribe to the podcast and to share it with others. The other is to visit my website, disabilityandchurch.com. That's disabilityandchurch.com. Hopefully, you will discover some resources that will help you on your own journey. Thank you, and God bless.